Gary Francione from the Rutgers Newark School of Law. We are very happy to have him here today. And I have to thank my Dean, Gregory Mark, for facilitating Gary's appearance today. Professor Francione received his BA in Philosophy from the University of Rochester and his MA in Philosophy and his JD from the University of Virginia. He was a law clerk for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor of the United States Supreme Court. He has been teaching animal rights theory and the law for more than 25 years. He's lectured throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe. He's been a guest on numerous radio and television shows. He's the author of numerous books on animal rights theories and animals and law, and his most recent book, The Animal Rights Debate, Abolition or Regulation, was published in 2010 by Columbia University Press. He is also the co-author of a series, Critical Perspectives on Animals, Theory, Culture, Science, and Law, also published by Columbia University Press. He teaches criminal law, criminal procedure, torts, and evidence, and serves as chair of the Appointments Committee at Rutgers. So please join me in welcoming Professor Gary Francione.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Professor Livingston and Brett Davinger. Where's Brett? Where is Brett? Brett, are you here? Anyway, who worked very, very hard to put this conference on. And I want to thank my former colleague at Rutgers, Dean Mark, who, before he left Rutgers, said, when I get to DePaul, I want to have a conference on animal, something, I mean, it's like most people. I want to have an animal conference. And he said, would you come? And I said, yeah, I'll come. And so I want to thank everybody for putting this together and for inviting me. And I also want to thank them for something very, very important to me. When I was asked to come, I said, you know, I'll do it, but you got to do one thing for me. And that is, I don't want any meat or dairy anywhere near where I'm speaking. And I was really careful about and the dairy, no honey, no dairy. I went through a whole list with Brett about what was, no non-dairy coffee creamers with whey or casein, nothing. And they accommodated that, and I appreciate that. And so I'm very, very grateful. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Monty Python, but the episodes used to begin with one of the Pythons saying, generally John Cleese, and now for something completely different. And so now for something completely different. When Dean Mark asked me to do the conference, he was not specific about what the topic was. When Brett called to ask to get specific, to invite me, I said, what's the topic? He said, the topic is animals and entertainment. And I said, I said, Brett, look, I'd like to accommodate the request. I'd like to come to DePaul, but I don't think I'm your guy. And he said, why not? And I said, because I don't believe in the use of animals in entertainment. I don't think we should use them. The idea of how we should regulate it is, for me, not an interesting question. We can't regulate it. Regulation doesn't work. There's one thing we need to do, stop using them. And then, by the way, we shouldn't be eating them either. And so Brett and I had this interesting conversation. He listened very, very quietly while I talked. And at the end of it, he said, well, let me think about this. I'll get back to you in a few days. I got off the phone, and I said to my partner, I'll never hear from him again. And he called back 3 days later, and he said, we really want you to come and say this to the group. So I thought, well, okay. So he agreed that it would be vegan, and so I came. However, let me say, I'm going to say some things today which will, I do not mean, I understand that, we have different views about these things. I have a different view from my friends who do regulation sorts of work. Okay? I don't doubt their sincerity. I don't doubt their good faith. I think they're wrong. And so what I'm going to do is talk about, and I'm going to be making comments about that today, and I certainly hope that it's certainly not intended to be offensive to anybody. It's intended simply to state my position, which is we don't think clearly about animal issues we engage in what I call and have called for some time now sort of a moral schizophrenia. We think in an almost delusionally confused way about animal issues, and I also believe that the notion that the law, yes, I know I'm a law professor, but the notion that the law is ever going to deal with this in an effective way is on the level of believing that a weight-challenged man slides down your chimney at Christmas time and puts things into stockings. It's a fantasy. The law is miserable at regulating animal abuse. You can't regulate animal abuse. Okay, so with that, let me start off by saying, let's take it one step at a time. Animals' use in entertainment can't justify it. But more importantly, you can't justify, that's a small number of animals that we're using. Not one. We shouldn't be using one. Okay? But the issue is, what I'm going to argue to you is that we have no justification for using animals. Now, you might think that that's a radical or an extreme position. It's not. You actually agree with me. You may not realize it yet. But you actually agree with the premises that lead you to the conclusion that we can't justify the use of animals in entertainment, and you can't justify eating, wearing, or consuming animal products. You just can't. And that's not a radical position. It's not a radical position at all. It's actually quite commonsensical. And it comes from things you already believe. Let's take a look at Michael Vick. We all know about Michael Vick. I gave a talk at a college recently, and it was like 300 young people there, and I said, how many of you have heard about Michael Vick? And there were so many hands, I said, let me ask the question a different way. Is there anybody in this room who isn't familiar with Michael Vick? And not one hand went up. We all know who Michael Vick was. He was arrested in 2007 for being involved in dogfighting operations and some property he owned in Virginia. He went to prison. He did a plea bargain. He went to prison. He came out in 2009. He plays for the Philadelphia Eagles. And we hate him. People hate Michael Vick. They don't just dislike him. They don't just dislike him, they hate him. I mean, recently he announced that, that he had a family dog. And the stuff that I saw on the internet was, again, I want to make it clear, I'm not defending what Michael Vick did. But I mean, the idea that, people get upset about Michael Vick. People are now really angry about the fact he's got a dog. This is bad, this is evil, this is wrong, this man is Nosferatu. He's bad, he's a bad human being. Irredeemable. He can't be redeemed. That was one question I was sort of playing with people on the internet this week, and I was saying, do you think that it's possible to change? Do you think it's possible to be redeemed? No, not Michael Vick. Not Michael Vick. And occasionally someone would say, well, yes, I think so, and then they would get attacked by everybody else. So we hate Michael Vick. Why do we hate Michael Vick? Well, he did really horrible things to these dogs. He inflicted suffering and death on dogs. Now, yeah, all right, so he inflicted suffering and death on dogs. But most people don't find that problematic in an absolute way. As a matter of fact, most members of the general public would say if you could kill some dogs to find a cure for cancer, it would be fun. We wouldn't like it, but it would be okay. You could inflict suffering and death on dogs. We're not saying that that's absolutely wrong. Okay, so then why are we so angry? Why are we so livid at Michael Vick? Because unlike the situation of vivisection, now let me be clear, I do not believe at all in vivisection. I would not kill one rat to find a cure for cancer. I mean, not that that would ever be an option, but I wouldn't do it. So I don't want you to think that he's promoting, I'm opposed to vivisection. Most people aren't. Most people think vivisection is fine. Or at least some vivisection is fine. That's a widely shared view. We think that if there's a compulsion or a necessity, that's what, that's okay. If scientists need to use animals in biomedical research to find a cure for cancer or something like that, we say, well, that's different. That's different from what Mike Vick did because that involves compulsion. That involves, we've got a conflict situation. It's us or them. Now again, I don't accept those arguments, but I understand them and other people accept them. So what makes what Michael Vick did wrong? Well, what made what he did wrong was that there was no compulsion. There was no necessity. What Michael Vick did was violate a principle everybody in this room agrees with. Whatever however you come out on things, ultimately, everybody in this room agrees that it's wrong to inflict pain, suffering, or death on a sentient being, a human or a non-human, without a good reason. You need some necessity. Now, we could have an interesting philosophical discussion for hours about what necessity means, but we don't need to. Because whatever it means, if it has any meaning, if it's a coherent concept at all, it's got to exclude pain, suffering, and death for reasons of pleasure or amusement. I mean, think about it for a second. If I said, well, you know, you should never inflict unnecessary suffering on children, but occasionally I do like to hear their little screams, so I beat them. You say, well, but obviously now you've got an exception which is so large you could drive a truck through it. So the principle of unnecessary suffering, which everybody agrees with, there is nobody. You know what? I've been doing this work for a long time now. A long time. And I have never met anybody who says, I disagree with that principle. We can have disagreements about how you apply it, but everybody agrees in theory with the idea that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals. By the way, is this doing anything? Can I just put this over here because it's sticking in my face and I don't like it? Is that okay? Is that all right for the filming? Okay. We all agree with the idea that it's wrong to inflict pain, suffering, and death on animals or humans without having a good reason. We can disagree what the reason about what necessity means in any particular concept, but we all agree if that concept has any meaning at all, it means you can't inflict pain, suffering, and death for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. I mean, I would say conventional wisdom is basically conventional wisdom, by which I mean what people think, not what philosophers think, not what animal rights people think or animal welfare. Not the average person on the street. Their conventional wisdom about animals is you shouldn't hurt them unless you got a good reason. But if you got a good reason, if there really is a conflict between humans and non-humans, humans win. So it's all right. Now again, I don't, I don't agree with that. I think that there's a certain, I think it's much more complicated than that. But I think wisdom that, that where there is a conflict situation, humans win. But you need a conflict situation in order to inflict suffering and death. The problem is, people, 99.9999999% of the uses that we make of animals can only be justified by pleasure, amusement, or convenience. As a matter of fact, I was out in the hallway talking. Where's Peg? Peg, are you here? Oh, there's Peg Kniff. Somebody I've known for how long? We've known each other a long time, Peg, huh? More than a quarter of a century. More than a quarter of a century. We're getting old, Peg. I'm sorry. We're getting old. Peg runs the National Anti-Vivisection Society here in Chicago. And the only use of animals that we make, that we engage in, that is not transparently frivolous, is the use of animals in biomedical research to find cures for serious human illnesses. I don't agree with it. I think it's wrong. But I think that's an interesting thing you can talk about. The rest of it's all a no-brainer. There is nothing interesting to talk about if you take animal interest seriously. The 99.99999% of what we do can only be justified by pleasure or amusement. Now, let's look at a particular instance. Let's start with eating. Because as I say, I'll get to the use of animals in entertainment, but that's a fraction. That's a fraction of animals. We kill in this world of ours 56 billion animals a year for food. A billion is 1,000 million. Think about that. 1,000 million is a billion, and we kill 56 billion land animals. That doesn't include fish and other aquatic animals. We don't even know how many of those we kill, but all of the estimates are it's at least as much, at least as many as the land animals that we kill. So we're talking every year about killing 100 billion animals a year. That's staggering. I mean, think about that for a second. That's absolutely staggering. Think about the enormous amount of suffering Think about, I mean, it's mind-boggling. Now, is there any compulsion or any need? Are we in any conflict with animals that requires us, when, you know, tonight, when you're deciding what you're going to stick into your mouth, are you sort of having some conflict with animals that say, oh, I must eat the hamburger? The answer is no, of course not. You know, it's 2012. Not even the United States government, the prime disseminator of disinformation on the planet, maintains that you need to eat animal products to be optimally healthy. I mean, you don't. The American Dietetic Association, which ain't exactly what you call radical, says that a vegan diet is perfectly fine, not only for normal people, but for people having kids, and for athletes, and for young people, and for old people. It's a great diet. Okay? So we don't need animal products to lead an optimally healthy life. As a matter of fact, mainstream healthcare people are increasingly telling us animal products are killing. But you know what? You don't, you know, we could debate that and say, well, you know, look at this study, that study. I mean, the bottom line is, I think it's clear that animal products are deadly. But you know what? You don't even have to agree with me there. All you need to agree with me on, and I would suggest that you couldn't possibly disagree, because there would be no empirical evidence to support your position, that we don't need animal products to be optimally healthy. We don't need them. And animal agriculture is destroying the planet. It takes between 6 and 12 pounds of plant protein to produce 1 pound of flesh. It takes 1,000 times more water to produce flesh than it does to produce potatoes. Animal agriculture is the greatest source of greenhouse gas. It is a greater source of greenhouse gas, animal agriculture, than the burning of all fossil fuels for transportation. It's destroying our groundwater. It's destroying our topsoil. It is an ecological disaster. The best justification, folks, that we have for killing 100 billion animals a year for food is that they taste good. We like the taste of them. So now the question becomes, how is that different from Mike Vick? And the answer is it's not. Michael Vick likes sitting around a pit watching dogs fight. The rest of us like sitting around a pit roasting the corpses of animals that have been treated every bit as badly, if not worse, than Mike Vick's dogs. I mean, I don't want to get into a discussion about who was abused more, but the reality is, you know, people get all upset. I mean, I was listening to Bruce talk before about these crush videos, which obviously are sick things, but you know, he was pointing out that an animal used in a crush video probably suffers less than an animal used in a, you know, caught in a trap or a glue trap. Certainly a glue trap where they can live for a couple of days, and you know, it's really horrible and stuff. So, you know, I mean, but the reality is, we get all upset about Mike Vick. We say, oh, it's horrible. He sat around this pit watching these dogs fight. And we talk about this while we're roasting our hamburgers or, you know, chicken or whatever we're doing. Think about how nuts that is. Think about, I mean, we're supposed to be one of the great, historically, one of the great justifications that we've had for why it's all right for us to exploit animals is we're rational and they're not. When you look at human behavior, ask yourself what the evidence for rationality is, because I think it's confusing and absent. And so now, one of the things I get when I talk about this, people say, "Oh, there's a huge difference between Mike Vick and me." Mike Vick watched it and he enjoyed it. You know, I don't. You know, I go to the store, I buy it. Okay. Well, those of you in law school, you know, in criminal law, we teach you that if I want you dead and I pay her to kill you, we both are in the same level of trouble. We both have committed murder. The fact that she pulled the trigger, I'm sorry, you look like a very nice person, but you know, so did John Gacy. And so you pulled the trigger or plunged the knife, I paid you, it's murder. Why? Because the law, the criminal law, which is very, very much reflective of morality, moral notions, says we're both morally culpable. She did it, I paid her. Okay? So, you know, you can't sort of say, well, I pay somebody else to do the killing, so it's okay. And the other thing is this.
I get really annoyed when people say, well, you know, I'm not like Mike Vick because, you know, I'm sort of like an ignorant about it. The thing is, anybody over the age of 3 knows that animal products do not grow on trees. We all know, whether you've watched gory videos, whether you've ever been to a slaughterhouse, whatever the situation is. I mean, you know, we all know that what we're eating is coming from tremendous violence. You may never have been to a slaughterhouse. You may never have watched a video of a slaughterhouse or of the various atrocities that go on in the production of animal products. But you know damn well you can't claim to not know what's going on and how what you got on your plate got there. You just can't. I'm sorry. That's just not credible. You know? And so the bottom line is we really are no different from Michael Vick. And let me make one thing about, you know, a lot of people say, well, I don't meat. Yeah, I agree with you on meat, but what's wrong with dairy? You know, they don't have to kill the cows. The answer is, if you know, again, that's crazy. That makes no sense. Animals used in dairy, generally, not always, but generally, live longer than animals used for meat, are treated every bit as badly as the animals used for meat, and they all end up in the same slaughterhouse anyway. So this idea, I know a lot of my friends in the animal community are not happy with when I say I think vegetarianism is an incoherent moral position. To say, when somebody says to me, I'm a vegetarian but I'm not a vegan, I always say, well, you know, that's sort of like saying I eat the meat from small cows but I won't eat the meat from large cows. I mean, why draw the line? It all involves suffering. It all involves death. As a matter of fact, I would say there's as much suffering and death in a glass of milk as there is in a pound of steak. I really believe that. I've visited slaughterhouses. I've been in various animal operations. I've seen dairy farms. I've seen dairy farms that are supposed to be the humane, happy dairy farms. And you know what? Nonsense. All torture, all death. Terrible stuff. Shouldn't consume anything. Now, so how are we any different from Michael Vick? The answer is we're not. He becomes a convenient person to hate. And there are probably other elements of that. He's a person of color, so that makes it easier in our culture to hate him. So there's that element as well. But the bottom line is, he's no different from the rest of us. He really isn't. And so I suggest to you, now, you know, again, I hope to finish up in a few minutes and we can sort of talk, I can take questions, but if there's anybody out there who's like sort of seen something I'm not, I need you to tell me, because I really think you all believe that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals, whatever your position is on animal rights, whatever your position is on the moral value of animals. If you believe animals have any moral value, you don't have to believe they have equal moral value, as I do, but that they have some moral value, i.e. they are not things, you cannot justify harming them at all. Not a question of like harming them a little bit or harming it. You can't justify harming them at all without compulsion, necessity, conflict. There's a conflict, then you got to ask the further question, how do you resolve the conflict? If there's necessity, you have to ask the further question, and then you and I might differ as to how we resolve those things. But the bottom line is we all agree. We all agree with the premises that it's wrong to inflict suffering and death for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience, and the biggest use of it, everything else we do with animals is a footnote relative to the use of animals for food. That is the main problem. And also, I suggest to you, we'll never find our moral compass as long as they're sitting on our plates, they're in glasses on our table, they're on our feet, they're on our backs. We'll never find our moral compass. As long as we're consuming them, we will never be able to sort of think clearly about them. And once we stop eating them, wearing them, using them, everything changes. Until we get to that point, nothing changes. Okay, so now, can we deal with the problem by regulating? And the answer is, I don't think so. I've been a lawyer for a long time now, and I started off when I was younger. I did animal welfare stuff. I really did. You know, in the early 1980s. I mean, you know, look, I got involved in the movement 30 years ago. This month, I got involved with it.
when I met Ingrid Newkirk in Washington, D.C. She came to the Supreme Court while I was there to pick up a dog that had been hit by a car. And she was then I think she was the disease control officer at the Washington Humane Society, I'm not sure. But she was involved, she was employed by them. And she came to pick up the dog. And I remember she said, I was pretty upset because I was holding this dog that was bleeding all over the place. The dog died while she was standing there talking. And I remember she said, you know, you ought to become a vegetarian. And I said, I am a vegetarian. Because I had been, when I was in law school, I had seen a slaughterhouse. But I didn't consider myself an animal rights person. I just went to a slaughterhouse. It freaked me out, so I stopped eating meat. But I'd never heard the word vegan, and I was not aware. Honestly, I had never heard the word vegan, and I was not aware that it was possible to live without consuming animal products. And so, I mean, remember, I grew up in the 50s and the 60s when, you know, they had commercials on television about what brand of cigarette was healthier for you. You know, and so the sort of, you know, the propaganda load for those of us who grew up at that time was pretty heavy. And so I had never heard of the word vegan and was not aware that it was possible to live without eating animal products. And Ingrid introduced me to veganism, and PETA had just formed, and I got involved with PETA. And at the time, we weren't really talking about the difference between rights or welfare. There really wasn't. It was just like, you know, we knew something was wrong with the old paradigm, with the old sort of the traditional humane society paradigm was wrong. But I don't think any of us at that time, in 1982, I can tell you, none of us really knew. You know, there are no roadmaps in outer space, and I don't think anybody really knew where we were headed. And so, you know, when I started doing animal. I worked with them on the Taub case. I worked with them on the Generelli case when I was at the University of Pennsylvania. You know, we knew something was wrong and the system had to be changed, but none of us was really sure about what that meant. So I was doing animal welfare stuff and whatnot. And then as I sort of kept on spending time doing animal welfare, I was seeing it was going nowhere. That, you know, that you'd put time and effort and energy and money and sweat and blood into these campaigns, and you'd end up with legislation that was so compromised that, you know, that you know, you started off with a good bill, and then it, you know, it got pulled back and pulled back and pulled back and pulled back. And then eventually it hit me, after I spent a good deal of time reading about the regulation of human slavery in this country. There was lots of regulations of human slavery, and they didn't work. None of the regulations worked because slaves were chattel property. They were pieces of property. They had an economic value. They didn't have inherent value, intrinsic value. They had an economic value. And yes, there were all sorts of laws that protected them, but every time those laws were invoked, you had a situation of a slave having a conflict with a slave owner. A property owner having a conflict with a piece of his property. You don't need to be tremendously intelligent to figure out who wins those conflicts. So there were all sorts of laws. But how many people went to jail or were ever punished for what they did with their slaves? And the answer is virtually none of them. Very few. Very few. Why? Because you have this particular species of property, a sentient human being who has interests, but you can't recognize those interests, because if you do, then it's no longer a thing. It becomes a person. You can't have that because you don't have slavery. Once you recognize they're persons, once you treat them as persons, you don't have slavery anymore. And so it occurred to me, this is exactly what's going on with the animals. Is that this is property. They have interests, but it costs money to protect their interests. And the only time we're going to spend that money is when we get a benefit, and it's usually an economic benefit. And so I developed this view that the level of animal welfare would always be low. And it would always be pegged to what I call the level of efficient exploitation. We would protect interests to the extent that we needed to protect interests to exploit animals in an efficient way. And we would not go beyond that. And you know what? You can look at examples and you see this is true. Look at the Humane Slaughter Act of 1958, which required that large animals be stunned before they're shackled, hoisted, and cut. That law was passed basically because it was economically beneficial for the industry. You got a 2,000-pound animal hanging upside down by her back leg where she breaks her pelvis when you pull the chain up, and she's conscious, she's moving around, she hits people, causes carcass damage, decreases the value of the meat. Doesn't work. So what do? We say, well, you know, we're going to stun, we're going to be humane, we're going to stun, we shackle and hoist them. And the problem with that is that they have interests, lots of interests in their lives, all through their lives. And so we pick this one interest
because we get a benefit from regulating that. And you know what? Things haven't changed. Look at the campaigns we have now. And again, I do not mean to offend anyone, but I look at this, let's have gassing of chickens. Now, if you look at, rather than the electrical stunning, if you look at, if you were to start, anyone in this room said, you know, law school sort of sucks. What I think I'm going to do is start a chicken slaughterhouse. You know, not many legal jobs. I want to start a chicken slaughterhouse. You would be crazy not to use controlled atmospheric killing, or what is used as shorthand, gassing, but controlled atmospheric killing. You would be crazy to use the traditional electrical stunning mechanism or procedure. Why? Because you have lots of carcass damage, because workers are injured. It's inefficient economically. And what is happening is, and if you look at the animal groups that are promoting controlled atmospheric killing, what you see is that they are taking the position, they are arguing to the industry, this is in your economic interest, and it is. And what is happening is you got some people who have large capital investments in current factories, but when those people change, when they expense that, you know, once through their accounting procedures, they expense that stuff out, or they replace that equipment, they're all going to go to controlled atmospheric killing. It would be irrational not to. Look at the gestation crate. The gestation crate is an economically inefficient way of dealing with pregnant sows. You're much better off using electronic sow feeders, which actually increases your production efficiency. It's a better thing to do. It's a better thing to do. Same thing with veal crate. The veal crate. Veal crate's going out in Europe and a lot of places here. Why? Because the Europeans have realized when you take a baby cow and stick that animal in a chute, under those circumstances, you know what happens? They get stressed. When they get stressed, they get sick. When they get sick, if they get sick before the 6 months when you slaughter them, then what's going to happen is you're going to end up having to call a veterinarian. It costs money. You take them out, you stick them in a small social unit where they don't have a lot of space, but where they got a little more space, boom, you cut down your veterinary costs. So what ends up happening is animal welfare is basically, you know, it's basically industry realizes that certain things are not particularly efficient. And the inefficiencies of factory farming are only coming to be seen now. Remember, factory farming started in the 1940s, 50s in the United States, right? And then it spread all over the place. So only now are we coming to see what the real costs of factory farming are and what the inefficiencies are. And so the level of animal welfare is very, very low. And it's always going to stay low. It's always going to stay low. And I think one of the worst things that's happened is that the animal movement in this country and in Europe has now moved into this happy exploitation movement. You know, cage-free eggs, free-range this, animal compassionate labels, you know, freedom food labels, you know, all of the groups, almost every large group in this country and in Europe sponsors or is involved with some sort of happy exploitation label. I think that is a disaster. Because what that is doing is telling people, you don't have to deal with the moral issue, or you can deal with the moral issue by compassionate consumption. I tell you, I just said those words, and I shiver. Compassionate consumption is a really problematic way of looking at things. I mean, it suggests that there's a right way of doing this, that there's a morally acceptable way of exploiting animals. There's not. And then you also have this weird situation where animal groups become partners with institutionalized exploiters, which makes no sense. So if you have Group X is boycotting or criticizing Corporation Y, Corporation Y eventually gives in. Group X says, yes, they really care about animal welfare, and they have the kumbaya moment. What does that say to the public? What does that say to the public? You know, I mean, I had one of my colleagues at Rutgers a couple years ago had read some article about PETA boycotting Kentucky Fried Chicken in Canada, and then calling off the boycott when Kentucky Fried Chicken in Canada agreed to phase in over the next 3,000 years, buying all of their chickens from animals that had been gassed and not stunned. And so PETA called off the boycott, which to my colleague meant it was okay to eat, if you were in Canada, it was all right to eat chicken. Now I'm sure, I know the people at PETA well enough to say, no, that's not the message we were intending to set out, but the problem is that's the message that is sent out. So now people say, gee, I can't wait until Kentucky Fried Chicken in the United States starts gassing chickens so that I can eat Kentucky Fried Chicken again. And it sort of makes me very sad to think that the clarion call of the revolution for animals is, let's gas the chickens. I mean, if that's what we're talking about, we haven't moved very far. So I think this is a real serious issue. With respect to animals and entertainment, we talked this morning about Associated Humane. I'm sorry, but I was involved in a case many years ago in which animals were abused in a film. And I learned a great deal about the use of animals in films. And I visited wranglers. I think that's where is Miss Rosa here? Yeah, they call wranglers. That's what they're called. Or, you know, yeah, handlers. You know, I visited a bunch of those places out in California, and they were horrible. The stuff that went on set was horrible. And as I recall, when they were using the chimpanzees, they were getting into grimace by using snakes. These people had snakes. The film was called Project X. It starred Matthew Broderick, as I recall, and there were issues about what went on there. And look, Associated Humane, again, I don't question the sincerity, I don't question the good faith, but Associated Humane is there because the movie industry allows it to be there and finances it. How effective do you think it can be in regulating it, even if it was possible to be regulated? And I do not believe it is. I mean, to say, yeah, we can stop a production. You do that too often, and you know what? The movie industry doesn't give you its largesse anymore, and you don't get your funding anymore. So the bottom line is that we can't regulate this stuff. Now, I know a lot of young people say, well, but what about animal law? You know, what about, can't we use the law? And the answer is, no, the law, look, what's law school, people? Law school is a 3-year property course. Well, you'll learn, you take property, but you also take like all these other courses, but they're all about property, by and large. Okay? The law is about property. Animals are property. They are chattel. They have no economic value. They have no intrinsic value, no inherent value. They are things. Do you really think the law is going to be effective, particularly in a world in which we're killing? Everybody eats them, people hunt them, they use them, they wear them. Does anybody really think that the law is going to be effective? I mean, look at anti-cruelty laws. I mean, if you really want an adventure in uselessness, go and study anti-cruelty laws. They are useless. They do nothing. They basically exempt, either explicitly or implicitly, all institutionalized uses of animals. That is, anti-cruelty laws will often say, this does not apply to the use of animals for food, the use of animals for agriculture, the use of animals in hunting, the use of animals in biomedical experiments, and you wonder, what the hell does it apply to? And the answer, it applies to the pathological circumstance where a couple of kids take a Dalmatian, tie the dog to a tree, and kill the dog, torture the dog. Yeah, it applies in those sorts of situations. Then people say, the anti-cruelty laws work. Cruel treatment has been punished. And the answer is, you're dreaming. You're dreaming. There is, what we do to animals that we exploit every day is worse than what people are convicted of doing under anti-cruelty laws. I remember some years ago, I was a guest on Court TV. It was the last time I was a guest on Court TV. And they had a trial where some guy got upset with his neighbor, and the neighbor had a little Yorkshire Terrier, and the little Yorkshire Terrier came and peed on the guy's grass, and the guy came and he kicked the dog. He's a small dog, you don't need to sort of do that too hard. Dog died. So this guy is being prosecuted for anti-cruelty under the anti-cruelty law. I don't remember what state it was, but anyway. So I was, those were in the days when they used to have the trials all day, and then we had the commentator sitting there with Nancy Grace, or who was ever doing it at the time, and I think it was Nancy Grace. And you'd watch the trial and they'd cut to the expert. So every time she cut to me, and she said, well, what do you think of that testimony? I said, well, look, I said, it's sort of really weird because we're all upset with this guy. We're all thinking he's a really cruel person, but those jurors are going to go home tonight. They're going to eat steak. And she cut to commercial and she said, no, stop that. I said, why? And she said, I want you to comment on the trial. I said, but I am commenting on the trial. This is like a show. This is a drama. This is craziness. We're all sitting around worrying about the guy kicking the Yorkshire Terrier, which he shouldn't have done. I'm not saying, that he should have done that. But that's not what, but because we want to pat ourselves on the back and say, we're humane, we're good, we're decent people. Pass me that hamburger. And the answer is, come on, people. If we take animals seriously, we got to do much better than that. But anyway, anti-cruelty laws don't work for lots of reasons. And I want to end. I mean, I've got a lot more to say, but I want to end by basically saying I think we're going in the wrong direction. I've been doing this for 30 years. 30 years. Okay, I'm pushing 60, and I'm telling you. By the way, being a vegan for 30 years, I have more energy than most of my students who are young enough to be my grandchildren now. And I don't care what anybody says. Anybody wants to tell me that eating a healthy vegan diet is 10 zillion times better for you, I disagree. However, I've been doing this for 30 years, and because I am a vegan, I will be doing it for another 30. But I can tell you this, that in the 30 years I've been doing this, I ain't seen it going in the right direction. There are more animals now being exploited in more horrific ways than at any point in human history. I listened to Bruce talk about the Yost case this morning, and I was thinking, it's no different now when he did that case than when I did Project X in the 1980s. It was Betty Denning Smith. She was the director of it, I think, at the time. Betty Denning.
Project X started with Carmelita Pope.
Carmelita Pope. That's right. Carmelita Pope. I remember Carmelita. All right. So we did that in the 1980s, and now in 2005, it's the same thing. We did all that anti-vivisection stuff in the 1980s, and now more animals are being used in biomedical research than ever before. The fur campaign. I mean, look, let's be real. There is no difference between fur and leather and wool and silk and all that stuff. There just isn't. There isn't. I mean, we have anti-fur campaigns in part because we're a misogynistic society and we like to look for excuses to grow up. No, that's why I would never participate in it. I thought the anti-fur campaign was terribly misogynistic. But the bottom line is, we have anti-fur campaigns because you walk up to somebody wearing a leather jacket and say something rude, you get your teeth punched out. But we have anti-fur campaigns, and you know what? In the 1970s, when I lived in England, you couldn't see fur on the streets of London. Now it's all over the place. Because the bottom line is we haven't gotten to the problem, and the problem is if we celebrate our hierarchy and our superiority, our supposed superiority, every day, ritually, 3 times a day, by what we stick in our mouth and what we put on our backs, there's never going to be any change. And that is why I decided some years ago, I stopped practicing law, I stopped doing animal advocacy with large groups, and I decided I was going to try to start something, a different sort of grassroots movement of people all over the place who were just interested in creative, nonviolent, vegan advocacy. And what I have found, it's really quite remarkable. I go around and I talk to groups all the time of non-animal people, just normal people who are sort of interested in the animal ethics issue, but don't really understand the issues. They don't work with groups, they're just interested. I can talk to them, they understand this perfectly. Now, you say, well, does everybody go vegan immediately? The answer is no. They don't. Well, some do. Some do. But in my judgment, we really err when we say, okay, well, you're not ready to go vegan immediately, so eat cage-free eggs or free-range eggs, or the answer is no. I'm never going to tell anybody. If somebody comes up to me and says, I'm not ready to go vegan immediately, I say, why? It's easy. Let me, what do you need? What do you need? Tell me what you need and I'll get it for you. What information do you need? It's really very, very easy. And if they say, I understand that, and I'd like some information, but I'm not ready to do it immediately, I say, fine. Then go vegan for breakfast, for a week or 2 weeks. Then when you see that you're not dead, then you go vegan for lunch for 1 or 2 weeks. Then you see you're not dead, and then you go vegan for dinner, and then you're vegan. And then, the next time you buy shoes, you don't buy leather. Next time you buy a shirt or a sweater, you don't buy wool. You don't buy silk. And boom, it's done. Easy. I think we make a big mistake when we tell people, you can, as my colleague Peter Singer says, that being a conscientious omnivore is a defensible ethical position. That's wrong. You can never do this right. You can never be a good slave owner. Yeah, some slave owners were better than others. Some inflicted more suffering than others. But the bottom line is, slavery was morally wrong. And I want to say this to you. For those of you who think animal welfare reform is doing something, you're dreaming. The difference between with these reforms, it's the difference between being waterboarded on a padded waterboard or being waterboarded on a bare waterboard. You're still being tortured. Maybe there's a difference, maybe, but it doesn't really matter. But again, I want to emphasize, we're never going to find our moral compass while we're sticking them in our mouths 3 times a day. Never going to happen. We really need to take a step back. If you believe animals have moral value, then you need, it's not a question of changing the world. You change your world by changing yourself first. And so I would suggest that if you take animals seriously and you believe they have moral value, please, if you are not a vegan, go vegan. Don't consume animal products. Talk to everybody you can about veganism. I'd like to leave you with one thought. If everybody who's presently a vegan in this world convinced one other person to be a vegan in the next year, and then that happened every year after that, the whole world would be vegan in 10 years. Think about that. Okay, I'll take some questions. Thank you. Yes, from New Jersey.
Yes, good afternoon, Professor. It's really an honor to hear you for the first time. I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Not so you specifically answer it, but perhaps you can take off a little bit. Why do you think that people in the mainstream animal protection movement despise you so?
Wow. Do they?
I'm afraid they do.
They do. Look, the question is why people in the mainstream animal movement don't like me. Actually, the word you used was despise. Yeah, no, actually, I am aware that they do. And I'm sorry about that. It's impossible in this movement to criticize what's going on. There's no such thing as criticism. There's no debate or dialogue that goes on in the movement. So I've tried for years things put together where prominent welfare supporters would come to Rutgers and we would talk about this stuff. They won't do it. I think most animal organizations are businesses. They are organizations that have large numbers of employees. They have to bring in a lot of money. The way you bring in money is by packaging and selling single-issue campaigns. I mean, I saw Dan Matthews, whom I've known for many years, was interviewed a couple years ago in some newspaper in California. Dan's at PETA. Is he still at PETA, kid? And Dan said, well, 50% of our members are vegetarian, and the other 50% think it's a good idea. I believe it's pretty much, that's not an exact quote, but it's pretty much accurate. I mean, think about that for a second. If you've got an organization where 50% of the people aren't even vegetarian, and 50% are vegetarian, but you don't know whether they're vegan, you ain't going to push veganism as a moral baseline too terribly strongly because you can upset people. So,
However, we do.
I'm sorry?
We do.
Well, you do, but you also promote, and again, I don't mean, look, I have a lot of affection I have a lot of fond memories for the time I spent at PETA, and indeed, we spent some good times together. But, no, I mean, she wrote a book, you wrote Monkey Business, and she talked with me quite a bit about that. And it's not that I in any way dispute the bona fides or the sincerity of the people at PETA, but look, the reality is PETA has really gotten into the happy exploitation movement. They promote all of these welfare reforms, and I'm sorry, when PETA says we're calling off the boycott of Kentucky Fried Chicken in Canada, what that says to people is, okay, PETA, when you praise John Mackey and Whole Foods and give him an award, when you give an award to Temple Grandin, which I actually thought it was a joke when I first saw you guys gave it. Temple Grandin designed slaughterhouses, and PETA gave an award to her. And again, I understand why they do that sort of stuff, but I think it's terrible because it sends a message to people. It sends a message that when you have PETA people saying McDonald's is leading the way in welfare and fast food animal welfare, if that's what you say. And that's a quote. I believe that's a quote from somebody named Lisa Lange. If that's what you say, who works at PETA, if you say to people, if I say to the public, I'm concerned about animals, we shouldn't exploit animals, McDonald's is leading the way in the welfare of fast food animals, what does that say? It says, well, if I'm going to eat meat tonight, I should go to McDonald's. And as far as I'm concerned, any movement that tells me that I should patronize that place ain't my movement. So I think the thing is, I just disagree with this. I've been trying to get a dialogue discussion going, and I want to say, I will say this to you. I would love to have Ingrid and Wayne Pacell and Gene Bauer and all my friends from the old days. If they're willing, I'm willing. and we can have a good conversation at Rutgers about whether animal welfare is doing anything to reduce animal suffering, whether animal welfare is not counterproductive. In my view, it's not only not doing anything to help animals, it's actually counterproductive, because it's encouraging people to believe that there's a right way of engaging in exploitation, and I do not believe that. Now, I'm sorry that people get upset with me when I say that. I go out of my way not to attack them personally or not to question their motivation. But the fact that you criticize these groups, every time when I say these things and they say, well, you're in favor of harming animals. You're harming animals. No, I'm not harming animals. I'm saying what you're doing is wrong. You need to rethink it. Now, if I'm wrong, they need to tell me why I'm wrong. But all they do is get upset with me, and they say that I am wrong. They don't tell me why I am wrong.
We have time for one more question.
We have time for one more question. You.
Hi, thanks. I'm just wondering if you think that the law is ever an effective avenue for reform or for to initiate a paradigm shift, and if that is true, which I would like to think so, at least in some fields, can that be applied to animals? Can animals ever benefit?
I think that the law, that's an excellent and a very complicated question. I think the law can be used, although I am somewhat, we have this idea that the legal system is the sort of the system which exists apart from the political system. And I don't believe that. I think the relationship between law and politics is a lot closer than we would like to think when we talk about the rule of law as if that is somehow divorced from political considerations. I think it's particularly, so whether it's useful for other situations, one could, I think, reasonable minds could differ on whether the law has been an effective tool for gaining equality for people of color. Because I look at the world and I say, gee, there still seems to be enormous amounts of racism. We just don't talk about it anymore. But I think that there's still enormous amounts of racism. So has the law succeeded? Well, in certain ways it has, and in certain ways it hasn't. It's complicated. I think it's particularly problematic where animals are concerned, because you can't increment, once you recognize X is a person, X is a person is no longer a thing. And once you recognize X is a member of the moral community and is entitled to full membership in the moral community, then you can take incremental steps to sort of to get to that position, or at least arguably you can. You cannot take incremental steps towards personhood. In other words, we didn't get the abolition of slavery because people made slavery more and more and more humane until it went away. As a matter of fact, the distinction between the abolition of everybody with respect to race-based slavery in this country, everybody agreed that race-based slavery should go. You had the abolitionists who said, we think slavery is terrible, and we're not going to support, softer whips, or, yeah, it may be better to whip your slave 10 times a week rather than 15 times a week, but you shouldn't be doing 10 times a week, and we're not going to support that sort of thing. And the regulationists who said, oh no, we're going to get rid of it eventually, but we need to regulate it and make it better and better and better. And so but we didn't get rid of slavery because they regulated it and got better and better and better. We got rid of it because enough, well, that's complicated too, but at least for our purposes, because enough people decided the institution was problematic. And so I think that using incremental steps to get to personhood is something that doesn't work. I think the law, I think animal lawyers can do useful things. I think that they can represent advocates and help advocates. It's the advocates who are going to change, who are going to shift the paradigm. It's the advocates who are going to shift the paradigm, not the lawyers. I think you make a mistake. Years ago, I was friendly with a guy named William Kunstler, who wrote the foreword to my first book. He was a civil rights lawyer. He started the Center for Constitutional Rights with my colleague Arthur Keynote in New York City. And Bill was a real, he and Arthur were sort of two of the main civil rights lawyers of that century. And he represented the Chicago 7. He was a remarkable guy. And I remember he said to me one day, he said, remember something? He said, we're cogs in the wheel, meaning lawyers. He said, we're cogs in the wheel of the system. And he said, the best thing we can do is to keep the good people out of jail while they change the world. And I think that animal lawyers have gotten to the point where they think They are going to change the world by getting courts to recognize that, you know, in certain cases we ought to give greater damages for negligent infliction of harm or something like that. I mean, that stuff's not going to change the world. That stuff's not going to shift the paradigm. It's going to further enmesh animals into the property paradigm. So I think there are things lawyers can do. When we had the clinic, when Anna, Charlton, and I had the clinic, we represented a lot of students, veterinary students, who didn't want to use animals in their, you know, I mean, we did cases at virtually every, and we had tremendous success in getting programs put into place in veterinary schools so that kids, as students who didn't want to cut up animals, didn't have to. We help people who were doing things like trap, neuter, release work, who were having trouble with municipalities. We did a lot of work with advocates who wanted to have peaceful, nonviolent protests, and they would have trouble getting permits and things like that. So there are things you can do to help those advocates as they press on the case in a creative, nonviolent way. But I think the idea that we as lawyers are going to change the world or change the system, I think that's fantasy. Can I do one more question or no? No? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody, and we'll reconvene in about 15 minutes.